Hello and welcome everyone to the launch of our latest report on migration in the UK's creative occupations and industries. So with thanks to the ongoing support of our funder, the AHRC, this is the 10th report in our State of the Nation series. My name is Hassan Bakshi and I'm the director of the Creative PEC. Now, I've mentioned in previous webinars that we conceived of this series following our observation that a perceived lack of data on the creative industries is too often held up as a reason for policy inaction. Put simply, it's easy for policymakers to argue they cannot introduce new policies if there's no data to guide policy design and evaluation. We know that there are major gaps in the evidence base of the creative industries, but in a number of vital areas, there is actually now a good deal of data. And the aim of our State of the Nations publications is to point to just these. One such area is internationalization. The market for creative goods and services is global, so we shouldn't be surprised that the creative industries are trade intensive and key destinations for foreign direct investment. They also employ disproportionate numbers of migrant workers, but surprisingly, there is next to no quantitative research on this feature of the creative economy. And this is one of the reasons why I'm especially excited to launch today's report. Now, at the Creative PEC, we pride ourselves in publishing research that is addressing the most relevant and pressing policy issues of the day. We're publishing today's report in the wake of the government's immigration white paper, with its stated intention of creating an immigration system which promotes growth but is controlled and managed. The launch of the UK's industrial strategy, which amongst its priorities must tackle the enduring problem of skill shortages and gaps in the creative workforce, is imminent. I'd also like to flag that alongside today's State of the Nations report, we are publishing a policy briefing presenting 4 key policy considerations for UK migration policy. And in ongoing work as part of our sector skills audits for the DCMS and the Creative Industries Council, we are considering what role migration policy should play in alleviating the skills pressures in the UK's creative industries. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Bernard and my colleagues at Newcastle University, who will talk through the report's findings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hassan, and hi everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you here today. I'm Bernard, I'm Head of Policy at the Creative PEC, and I will be chairing today's session. So before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes to kick us off. So first of all, the format is that we'll begin with a presentation of some headline findings from the report by 2 of the report authors, after which we'll open to 2 expert respondents and audience Q&A. So I'll introduce our panelists as we go, but I would say to those of you in the audience, do post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen as we go through, and we'll try and answer all of those as we go through. So the event itself will last about an hour. It'll also be recorded and made available shortly on the Creative PEC's YouTube channel. And by registering for this event, you will soon receive our latest State of the Nations report directly to your inbox. But if not, you can also find it on our website. So at this point, I'd like to introduce 2 of the report authors to share a short presentation with some headline findings from the research. These are Professor Sarah Maioli, one of the Creative PEC State of the Nations research leads for internationalization and reader in economics at Newcastle University, and Dr. Daniel Samanjantak, who is a research associate at the Creative PEC and Newcastle University and one of the co-authors of this report. So Daniel and Sarah, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, sorry. Okay, it worked before. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here, but sorry, it's always a bit of a. Okay. Share. Right. From the beginning. Okay. So in this report, we talk about migration in UK creative occupation and industries. So I hope that my screen is clear. Everything is fine on your side. Okay, great. Let's delve. So we tap into 3 sources of data. So the first one is the recent immigration system statistics. So on the 1st of January 2021, after the departure of the UK from the European Union, there was an introduction of a point-based system for immigration. So there was a big change where basically any non-UK worker that wants to seek work in the UK has to come under a new scheme where they need a visa, in most of the cases a visa and sponsorship. So we gathered data on these new visas granted to sponsor foreign workers who applied from outside the UK. And the data range, therefore, from the first quarter of 2021 to the first quarter of 2024, because this is the span of data that has consistent classification at a granular level that allow us to look at creative occupations, so we will look at that. The second source of data is the LFS, so the labor force survey. This is also quarterly data, and the span is longer, is including from 2014 to 2024. And this is nice because it allows us not just to look at occupation, but it allows us also to look at industries, something that we cannot do with the visa data, because unfortunately there is not granular level on the industry of the sponsor for this visa. So there is only one digit industry level data. But for the LFS survey, so the labor force, we can actually dig down both occupation and industries as defined by DCMS, the department that is define such creative industries and occupations. The last source of data, which I will, in the interest of time, I'm not going to present now, is an international comparison of the UK stance in terms of openness or restrictiveness on the movement of workers, using an index that has been devised by the OECD, is the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. And that gives us basically an international comparison where the UK is located in terms of movement of workers. Now, the highlight figure that probably everybody's going to be interested into is to know what is the percentage of foreign labor, so of non-UK labor in creative industries. And using the LFS, I can give you the highlight figures here. We can show the comparison between creative and non-creative industries over the period from 2014 and 2024. And you can see the trend that both are growing, they are nearly parallel. But the creative industries are higher. So they started from 12% in 2014, reaching 16% in 2024. So over all the period, they have been higher compared to the non-creative industries, are currently 14%. Now, looking at the data on visa, the highlight is that since 2021, half of the workers entering the UK for a creative occupation, they have basically entered through a skilled worker visa, so 50%. The skilled worker visa is granted for periods, let's say, typically up to 5 years. So they are for longer period of time. They can be, of course, renewed. This was followed by the creative worker visa, which covers 20% of the creative workers. And the creative worker visa is a temporary visa, so typically is granted for up to 12 months, although it can be renewed also for up to 12 months. And the third most frequent type of visa granted is the temporary global business mobility visa, because the global business mobility visa can be granted also for longer period. But again, for up to 12 months period, this covers 15% of the worker. And here it's a table summarizing the numbers of from 2021, and we basically show only the annual data here, and the growth as well from 2021 to 2023. We divided them between temporary worker visa and the worker visa. And we can see that in the first row, we have the creative worker visa, so the temporary visa in creative occupation. And there has been a growth of 84.6% over the period. And this compares with actually a reduction of 67.6% for non-creative occupations, also in temporary, for temporary visa. And then if you compare instead the growth of the skilled worker visa, which are coming for longer period, for creative occupation, this has grown by less than 20% over the period, so 18.8% for skilled workers. And in comparison for basically non-creative occupation, we can see that the growth has been 113.3%. And also, if you consider other type of worker visa, again, you see there has been a reduction in creative occupation, but really a boom in non-creative occupation. So we can see that overall, from this table, over just these 3 years, the share of temporary workers visas that have been granted to creative workers, they jump from 10.5% in 2021 to 15% in 2023. So there has been an expansion in temporary workers in creative occupation. But on the other side, for the worker visa, which are staying for longer period, the creative occupation shrunk from 21.5% to just 8 in 2021 to just 8.2% in 2023. So there's been basically a shift in composition. At least this is what we see from the data. But it is also to be explained with the fact that, of course, before the introduction of this system, there was a lot of temporary movement of workers in creative occupation coming from Europe that didn't need a visa. So now we can actually see the visa, but there has been also other things going on. So there has been, for example, in terms of skilled worker visa, there's been an expansion during this period of workers coming in non-creative occupation with skilled worker visa for health and care, for example, and an expansion in IT and software and services skill worker visa, which we will see in a moment. In terms of where do they come from, so the origin of visa recipients, we can see that almost 2/3 of non-UK creative workers that are granted a new visa are from Asia. So 62.6%, and in particular, India is taking the lion's share with 53%. And this is covering the whole period from 2021 first quarter till the first quarter of 2024. Europe comes second with 16.8% share, and then Africa and the Americas are both at about 9.1%. Now, if we look instead at the occupations, and here we just plotted the ones that are attracting at least 1% of non-UK workers, we can see that the largest occupations for creatives are basically the top two programmer software development professional, which is attracting nearly 32% of non-UK workers, and IT business analysts, architects, and system designer. And these two categories, together with the information technology and telecommunication professionals, and also the web design and development professional, they make up 65% of all the visa granted to creative workers. So they are all in this IT, software, and computer services sector. These workers also have the characteristics that enter mainly through the worker visa, so they are not temporary workers. Instead, if we compare the arts-based creative workers, and we can see that, for example, there are 7.48% of non-UK workers in the category of actors, entertainers, and presenter. Also more than 7%, 5.52% in musicians. And we have also artists, 1.63%. So all the arts-based creative workers enter predominantly with instead a temporary visa, the creative worker visa, except for authors, writers, and translators, who instead mostly hold a skilled worker visa. Now, going... Now, some words also on the what we observe about the visa sponsors. So the organizations that are sponsoring workers who enter the UK, we can see, we have data from 2014 first quarter, also to 2024 first quarter. And what we can see is that we can see the number of applications by the organization to become new sponsor. And the organization that are registered to sponsor the foreign workers, both creative and non-creative, because unfortunately we cannot distinguish for this data between creative workers or non-creative. We can only see whether they are applying, at least these are publicly available data, whether they are applying for sponsoring skilled worker, temporary worker, or both. And what we can see is that there has been clearly a growth around 3.5 times for the application of skilled workers, whereas for the temporary workers or both categories, these have flat line basically throughout the period. And I basically now ask Daniel to continue, and I will keep sharing my slides. Daniel, if you're okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. So as we've already seen the most popular creative occupations for the recent visas, we also see increasing shares of these occupations within both UK workers and non-UK workers over the past 10 years. The shares of programmers and software development professionals, as well as IT business analysts, architects, and system designers, they're already visibly notable in size, but they still increased among both UK and non-UK workers, more strongly among non-UK workers. For example, by 2024, 19% of UK workers and 30% of non-UK workers in creative occupations are programmers and software developers. But during this period, the same period, the share of marketing, sales, and advertising directors increased among UK workers, but actually fell among non-UK workers in creative occupations. So this shows the variation in trends between creative occupations. Can we go to the next slide, Sarah?
Yes.
And moving from type of occupation to type of industry, we also see variation in the creative industries, in how the creative industries rely on non-UK workers. For creative industries, this ratio is higher than 1 in both 2014 and 2024. In other words, in both years, if you put UK workers to stand in one group and non-UK workers to stand in another, and you throw a football into each group, the ball you threw into the non-UK workers group is more likely to land on someone working in the creative industries than the ball you threw into the UK workers group. This is not the case for non-creative industries, where the odds are nearly even at 0.99 ratio. So this is also varies across creative subsectors. For example, in 2024, non-UK workers are more likely to be working in advertising and marketing, crafts, design and designer fashion, IT, software and computer services, museums, galleries and libraries, and publishing. Going on to the next slide, we see that the size and growth of non-UK workers in the creative subsectors also vary by regions. As we use the color green to indicate positive growth, the good news is that we see growth across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and in regions beyond just London. In the IT, software, and computer services, we even see growth in nearly all regions. And overall, the regional snapshot suggests that the regions are successfully attracting global talent to contribute in local creative economies. And in my next slide, using the labor force survey, we can also see the variety of nationalities that make up the non-UK workers in creative industries. EU nationals still dominate in creative industries, and the share is around half of the non-UK workforce, but it is even more dominant in non-creative industries. And once again, once we look at each creative subsector, again, there are variations. Some notable patterns include South Asian nationals, who are also major contributors in IT, software, and computer services, North American nationals in music, performing, and visual arts, and also nationals in Oceania contributing in advertising and marketing. All in all, this shows the exciting composition of international talent in UK's creative industries. So please let me hand back to Sarah to conclude.
Right. So we can see that the UK's creative industries, we know they are a priority sector in the upcoming industrial strategies, and we can see that they are attracting talent globally. And now we have even the confirmation, even with more recent data. But we want to basically remark that in order to remain competitive, it's important and to allow a growth and react also rapidly to global challenges, in particular technological shocks like the artificial intelligence. It's important that our creative industries remain flexible and able to attract top international creative talent when is needed in the future. Another consideration that we have observed is that there have been recent increases in visa costs that may also impact the future attractiveness of the UK in terms of temporary workers, and especially creative workers that often are not on very high salaries. So this could affect further the composition of creatives moving to the UK, and it's important to assess this in the future. And also we want to highlight that there are data challenges that remain, and so we are obviously hoping for an improvement in data collection. So just to mention, one is the fact that we are still not able to monitor properly the freelancers movement, so the freelancer ability to offer their labor services in the UK. And of course, we know how important freelancers are for our creative industry. So we hope that in the future the statistics can be improved in this respect. We thank you for listening, and of course we invite you, if you're interested in diving deeper into this. There is a full report and some additional online material with additional statistics. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Daniel, for that fantastic introduction to the report and some of the headline findings. And I would really echo your suggestion for listeners to have a look at the full report. There is a wealth of additional statistics and data in there and beyond what has been shared. So really encourage you to have a look. So at this stage then, it's our time to open to our expert responders. And I'm really delighted to introduce our first expert responder today. So Dr. Madeleine Sumption is Director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford and a member of the Migration Advisory Committee, which is an independent panel that advises the UK government on migration issues. So Madeleine, I'll hand over to you first to hear your opening response.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for inviting me along. It's a very, very interesting report. I thought I'd just say a little bit about the broader context of all this in terms of where it sits in overall immigration policy, which, as I'm sure many people listening will know, has been on something of a rocky ride over the last few years. We had, so effectively with the post-Brexit immigration system, we had these unusually high levels of migration, and for a host of reasons, mostly completely unrelated to the creative industries. So, for example, people coming in, large numbers of people coming in as care workers on the skilled worker visa, international students, and so forth. Now, some of those people actually will be in the creative industries. A couple of the groups that we've seen quite large numbers of are people who are family members of people on skilled worker visas and international students. And we unfortunately kept echoing the data point, which I very much agree with. We do need better data in this area. We don't know a lot about what those people who they have work authorization in the UK, but they're not tied to any particular job or employer. And actually, if you look at the data over the last few years, it suggests that that a lot of the growth in the non-EU workforce across almost every industry appears to have been driven by these groups of people who have work authorization but are not coming in linked to a particular job. Now, the previous government then early last year brought in various restrictions, including on some of those family members. So we had a little bit of a kind of boom and bust in terms of policy liberalizing, more people coming in, and the pendulum swings in the other direction. The previous government also, as mentioned, brought in these higher salary thresholds, which will have affected many of the occupations in this report, because a lot of the people we're talking about. So the main salary threshold went up from just over 26,000 to 38,700. So obviously a reasonably sizable increase. Figures are slightly lower for younger people, but that will have had an impact. Now, we've then recently, about a month ago, the government, the newly elected, well, still sort of newly elected Labour government published its white paper. And so there are going to be some further changes as well, but that will also have an impact on creative industries. There's still quite a lot that we don't know about those changes and precisely how they're going to be designed. But probably the largest impact, well, one of the largest impacts that's relevant to this discussion is that some of the middle skilled, more technician type roles will face a new process. The employers will have to show that they're complying with a sort of industry workforce plan to try and improve training of people in the British workforce. There will be increases in the salary thresholds, although we don't know how much, and it will take longer for some people to get permanent status, although it's not clear whether that will apply, to what extent that will apply to the kinds of occupations that we're looking at in this report, because my expectation would be that people who, relatively highly paid people on the skilled worker visa would may not face the new longer path to permanent status anyway. And of course, in the creative industries in particular, we have all of these people on temporary visas and they don't have a path to settlement already. I think that, the big sort of idea behind Labour's immigration policy is that they want to link skills and immigration policy more coherently. The two in the past have not really spoken to each other directly. One reason for that is that it's actually quite difficult to make them speak to each other directly. I think I'm not saying that it can't be done. There is obviously just having that conversation in a more joined up way has its benefits. I think there's sometimes, when people talk about immigration and skills, there's sometimes a sort of sense that maybe, slightly simplistic sense that maybe we have this sort of cup, right? We have a certain, we're filling up a cup and we need a certain number of people in this industry. And, if the cup is only 2/3 full, once we've filled it up with the domestic workers, then we top it up with immigration. And in that logic, then if you trained more British workers, you would have fewer people coming on visas. Now, I think that's probably actually quite unlikely to be the case in practice, unless you actively restrict those visas. what you may just see is the industry expand. So, you have more IT workers if you train more British people, but it doesn't stop people from coming from overseas for two reasons. Partly because people still want to come here and they apply for jobs and employers want to hire them. And so these sectors, like IT, which is obviously a big driver of the stats that you've just shown, they may just become bigger. There's also something I think particularly interesting in the case of creative industries is that some places just become more of a hub for certain types of activity. And that doesn't necessarily. So I think you may train more people in the arts, for example, and find that we just do more arts in this country. Rather than necessarily saying that we then have a sort of smaller demand for other people. All of this is to say that there isn't. I think the key kind of problem to avoid is some idea that there's a certain number of people and we know what it is, and once we've brought them in or trained them here, everything is going to be fine, because we don't really know what that number is. And I actually think that there's a argument saying, rather than thinking of this in terms of skills shortages and sort of what is the deficit that needs to be filled, it actually is easier for immigration policy to think about in terms of what is beneficial, and to focus on designing an immigration policy that admits people that are considered to be beneficial. Now, obviously, that's in the eye of the beholder, and there are plenty of arguments to be had, and reasonable people will disagree on when it is beneficial to allow people to come to the country on visas or to be able to stay. But that, I think, is probably the sensible lens to be looking at it through. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Madeline. And that was such a helpful way of framing as well. Also, some of where the areas in the immigration white paper might intersect with some of the questions and opportunities for sector policy. And I'm sure many in the audience will have kind of questions on some of those points. And equally as well, I think really useful to have that framing around the relationship between skills policy and migration policy. I think it's fair to say that in the same way that we know that policy on data on migration in the creative industries is a need for more development, I think the same is true for skills in the creative industries as well. And so I think that maybe that's an interesting question as well around what can we do now, what data might we need to kind of meet that intersection that you've highlighted. So at this point, I'd really like to introduce our second expert responder to share her comments, and then we'll open up to Q&A. And thank you everyone who's been putting questions in the chat. And if you haven't put your question down yet, please do. So our second expert responder is Marta Foresti, who is chair of the Global Creative Economy Council, which is a joint initiative led by the British Council and the Creative PEC, and also CEO of Largo Collective, which is a research and creative collective focused on migration, culture and the arts. And prior to this, she was also managing and executive director of global affairs think tank ODI, where she's now a senior visiting fellow. So Marta, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Sarah, Madeline, and Daniel for a fascinating presentation and comments. I have three quite quick points. And yes, I would like to carry on talking, of course, because this deserves more attention. The first point, it relates to the nature of the creative industries, because obviously when you think about migration and the creative industries, we think about workers and employers and skills, which is what we heard about, and it's fascinating to have these insights. But the other aspects about creative industries in the UK is all the events and all the, investment actually to make the country attractive in terms of its creative industries for people that come from outside of the country. And here, the point I want to drive home in is that I need to ask you to sort of bear with me for one more data point, and I'll very quickly share one very quick image, which is, and those of you who know me know that this is something that I've been working on for some time, which is trying to monitor what happens to short-term business and visitors visas. So here we're not talking about immigration visas. In fact, we are talking about visas designed for temporary movement, typically 3 months, but it's the kind of visas that if you are booked to play at Glastonbury in a couple of weeks, or if you have a showing at 154 at Somerset House, or indeed this week during the London Design Biennale, you would apply for if you come from overseas. And these are the sort of the numbers of application, the rejection rates for the top 20 nationalities by numbers of applications. So here we're looking only at countries where there is a significant numbers of applications. And there are some surprising things in this, in these figures, to me at least. But one thing that clearly resonates with some of the things that Sarah said earlier, which is that there are such low numbers of visas awarded to applicants from Africa. And this is something that we see happening a lot in the rejection rates of short-term visas. I'm forever baffled by the data on Nigeria, where there is a quite significant numbers of applications for short-term visas as much as Pakistan. Actually, last year, or Turkey, last year, the numbers of application was similar to India and China. The size of the bowls is the numbers of application. And yet, if you apply for a business or visitors visa from Nigeria, there's about more than 40% of the chances that will be rejected, also very high cost because the fees are non-refundable. So the second point I want to drive home, and I'll stop sharing because I don't want you to get too distracted by data. I'll be very happy to share. All this data is publicly available. Is to basically suggest that I think there is an anomaly or an issue, particularly when it comes to Africa and the creative industries in the UK, given the level of interest that there is right now in, think about the V&A exhibition on Africa fashion, think about the rising importance of 154 at Somerset House, and the understanding that the continent has so much to offer to the UK creative economies and to the UK standing in the world to contribute talent and ideas, and the fact that it is particularly challenging for African applicants, not just to come and work in the UK, but also to come and visit and share sort of talent and innovation ideas. And I would argue that although this technically diverts from migration policies, because these are not migration visas, but it contributes to this idea of the UK being an attractive place for talent in the creative industries and sectors. And also, let's not forget that if you are organizing Glastonbury or if you are organizing 154, you want to make sure that those those artists that you book can make it to this country. And I certainly anecdotally working a little bit with creators on the continent, I keep hearing that is becoming really difficult. And also comparing it to Schengen is becoming harder and harder for African creatives to visit the UK. And as you know, there is a straightforward parallel with in the academic sectors with conferences and scientists and others in terms of being able to contribute to what are, I think, really cornerstone of the UK creative economy. And this leads to my last point, and I really want to finish with a kind of a zooming out on a policy issue. We heard from Madeleine some reflections how this sits in the broader strategy of the current government on its immigration policies. I want to comment on the international policies of this government, and particularly in the current context, which is one where not alone, but the UK has significantly reduced its overseas aid budget, and generally, there is a debate, obviously also politically, about the importance of sort of multilateral engagement and remaining, a relevant power in the world, and at the moment, a lot of interest and expectations on the importance of so-called soft power to contribute to the UK standing in the world. And by soft power, there are different definitions, but let's agree that we're talking a non-financial influence and contribution that the country can exert or influence the rest of the world. And arts and cultures and the creative economy are very much at the heart of these conversations, along with sports and other matters. And this idea that the UK has a lot to offer, particularly in the context where there is a perception that the US soft power has diminished with the current administration, to really maintain this level of ambition and engagement on being a global leader on the creative economy, culture, and the arts. In my view, without human mobility, without being able to attract talent, that soft power risks being very, very hollow. And in fact, risk really being a bit of a known goal in diplomatic terms, because of course in the context where, as we all know, things like the British Council and the BBC World Service are threatened by severe cuts, and there is a general sense that UK will put less money on the table, it's all very good to show up with the notion of soft power, but if that soft power does not come with very concrete things like visas and a fair and reciprocal arrangements for for sharing of ideas and talent, then I think there is a real risk of undermining this policy effort and this actually, moment of great political clarity, where you see the Foreign Office and the CMS collaborating and creating the Soft Power Council and really taking very intentional steps to to insist on the potential of soft power in the UK and the world. My view is that without visas, or making visas so expensive and so difficult to get for people to be able to travel to this country, there is a real risk that that will ring a little bit too hollow, particularly in major economies that I showed you earlier, some of the short-term rejection visa. We're talking about Pakistan, Nigeria, Ghana, India even, where the rejection rates are so high. So with that, just final thoughts. Thanks again for having me and for such an interesting conversation.
Thanks so much, Marta. And I would love to know a little bit more about maybe what's underpinning some of those rejection rates. And I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to have a look into that, but you know, I think that both that and I think that soft power angle is really, really crucial for us to keep in mind, both in terms of how migration policy in the UK might affect perceptions of the UK, but also the role that non-UK workers who've come and either worked or studied in the UK then go to play in domestic economies in other parts of the world, and the extent to which they bring networks, knowledge, skills, values from that time here is, I think, really important to think through as well. So I've seen that we've had a few questions come in through the chat, so I'm going to just open directly to audience Q&A. So our first question is from Tamsin, and Sarah and Daniel, this might be one for you. So do temporary creative workers, for example, musicians applying to come to the UK to perform in music festivals, have to pay the creative worker visa fee and the NHS surcharge, or do they just pay the surcharge if the visa is processed? So maybe if you might could maybe explain a little bit the visa that we're talking about here, and then answer Tamsin's question.
Maybe I can take this question. Right. Okay. So the visa rules are very complex, and the cost of the visa are also dependent on how long somebody stays in the UK. So, for example, the health surcharge is not payable if you stay in the UK for a short period. So, if I'm not wrong, it's up to 6 months. Beyond that, you have to pay. What we have noticed is from what I have noticed reviewing all this cost is that there is clearly a jump between temporary and longer term cost. So there is the cost become really significant, especially if you come to the UK with dependents, you have to pay and you want to stay for, I don't know, let's say 2 years, right? With a skilled worker visa. You have to pay the health surcharge in advance and for each person, so for yourself as a worker and for your dependents. This can really, for creatives, can add substantial. If you know, so the salary has to be obviously high enough to justify such cost. So yeah, so there is a table that on the supplementary online material that is summarizing all the costs. Of course, they are valid as of now. As we know, there has been this white paper, and there are going to be changes and increase in cost again once the legislation will be implemented. So you can have a look at the supplementary material online to have a flavor of what the costs are now. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. So we had another question from Pauline, which I know Daniel's answered in the chat, but I'm really keen to maybe bring some other perspectives in on this one. So the question is there an argument for presenting data separated out as to creative and technology, given that this is not a fully integrated sector, as we see with current tensions in the development of AI, for example? Here in this case, where the creative community is concerned for transparency in the use of IP by tech companies. So there's a question of definition around creative industries, right? So IT, software, computer services, and creative occupations often associated with those play quite a big role in the statistics here. Should we think about these as being a kind of creative or as a distinct technology area? Marta, I wonder actually if I might bring you in on this, I guess, given your work from a kind of more global perspective on that question around kind of creative and technology and thinking about migration issues for the sector.
I mean, I don't have a strong, I mean, I don't have a strong views, and so I don't know whether in other countries these categorizations are done differently. I was also struck by the fact that if we include any, I don't know whether there is any qualifications about those IT sectors, but if the creative workers visa is open to everybody working in IT on any kind of applications, then yes, and I'm not given the data that you shared, Sarah, that shows such high uptake in that sector, then yes, it'd be interesting to just look at the data without that, just to understand the more sort of traditional way of thinking about the creative economy. The problem with this, I find, and there's been, there is also discussion, is that I think we need to be careful not to spend too much energy trying to define in a way, because I think there are lots of questions also more broadly about, for example, gaming or other dimensions of of creative industries that are not everybody agrees are part of the same, are similar to others. I think that these sectors is what makes the UK. So I think they all contribute to this notion of the creative economy, and I think from that perspective, actually, it really matters to have them, to acknowledge the broader range rather than the narrow range, particularly when we want to drive home the potential of the creative economy in terms of growth for this country. And so, although it might be, I understand I think it will be important to consider the specific effect. And it was interesting to see, I think it was Daniel's slide, that there are very significant differences in the subsectors in terms of uptake of visas. So I think that deserves, and actually, to come back to your point, we don't really have, partly because of the way short-term visas are applied, there's not much in terms of motivations, but I think to try to compare the extent to which those are, there is a resemblance in terms of subsectors where people apply for short-term visas, which also actually goes to the question of the fees, because to be able to play at a concert or a gig, it is often, depending on what kind of artist you are, and you do use the short-term visas routes to enter sometimes multiple times to the country. So I don't have a particularly strong view. I think I don't know enough about whether there is, whether the categorization, the classification that we in the UK is in line with international practices in terms of what to do with IT and software. My view is that a more comprehensive definition of the creative economy is to be preferred to one that starts to split it down to many fine lines, even though people have very strong views and sentiments about what truly is, a culture in the creative industry and what is not.
That's really helpful, Marta. And I think it's right as well that, even when you look at different types of visas, the kind of segmentation between different subsectors is not super clear cut. So skilled workers visas, from the data, still look important across creative subsectors, even if the arts-based subsectors are maybe more likely to use the temporary worker visas. So I wanted to pick up on another sort of set of questions in the chat. And Madeline, I think this is really about the kind of point around sort of skills and migration. So the question was whether the data that we have on sort of migration statistics maps neatly to to skills shortages, or more specifically, whether we see that areas where there's a high input of non-UK workers into the workforce maybe maps with where we see skills shortages. But I wondered whether we could maybe broaden this out to ask a little bit about your work on the Migration Advisory Committee and how you think about that relationship between skills data and migration data and skills policy, migration policy. You mentioned suggesting a kind of benefits focused approach might be the way to think about this, but really interesting to share a little bit more about how those decisions are made and how some of these considerations might be brought through.
Yeah, so the Migration Advisory Committee has done a little bit of work on this, and generally we don't seem to see a strong correlation between where you try to measure the shortages and which occupations migrants are coming into. The big caveat on this, though, is that it's actually really challenging to measure shortages. It sounds like the sort of thing that you ought to just be able to, pluck some data and say there's a shortage here and there isn't a shortage there, and that's actually really not the case. Partly, so vacancies obviously is one thing you can look at, but there are plenty of reasons. But vacancies are naturally just higher in some occupations. If they have a lot of turnover, you see higher vacancies. And one of the things actually that we found is that if you look at this kind of broad brush level and you try and just identify, okay, use the same data for every occupation, things like, hours worked or vacancies, or, are wages going up, because you might expect wages to go up when there's a shortage. If you look at that across broadly across occupations, you get one picture. But then when you actually look at an individual occupation, the first thing you do is throw out all of that data and say, actually, in this occupation, what really matters is such and such. And what my takeaway from that has been actually that these kind of large scale exercises to try and kind of pluck out of the hundreds of occupations in the economy, which ones are facing a shortage. I personally don't think those exercises have a huge amount of value. I just don't think they're very accurate. I think the picture is always so idiosyncratic that every occupation you look at, there's a different story about precisely what's going on. And sometimes you see that there are challenges recruiting, so the challenges for training domestic workers for particular reasons. In other cases, it's actually not so much a training issue, but maybe people don't go into that occupation, or they don't stay in the occupation, often because the pay and conditions are not very good, or it's too casualized. Obviously, that's a big issue in some of the arts-based creative occupations. So I think in theory, it is possible at a really granular level to get a good picture of each occupation and come to what will be a very subjective decision. It's not a sort of technocratic science, but in theory you can do this. The challenge obviously is that we have hundreds of occupations and they're all very different, and so doing that in a sort of systematic way to inform immigration policy is actually quite hard.
Thanks so much, Madeline. And I can see that is a real challenge as well for creative occupations, which on the ground can vary so much in skill set and need. And I'm going to also take this opportunity to say a huge thank you for joining us, Madeline, because I know you have to leave a little bit early for the session. So thank you so much for sharing your insights.
You are most welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'm going to move back to some of the questions that we've got here. So I've got a question here from Jonathan. There was a question about differences across regions in the chat. So I think, and noting that the report does have a bit of data on this, Daniel, I wonder actually just for the benefit of everyone, if you could maybe share a little more about that kind of regional variation picture that you highlighted in terms of non-UK workers in the sector.
I think there's currently a big limitation on the number of data that we have. And so even when we're looking at the labor force survey, there is a problem of small sample sizes if we look at very specific occupations by nationalities, by regions. And so I think the general trend that we're seeing, even from the LFS, is that generally there are differences in the decade growth across regions. And the most reliable data comes from the most of because the sample sizes for London, for example, is pretty big and reliable. So we know that generally, like the trends in London are reliable. But at the same time, the sample size for people who are in IT software and computer services subsector is pretty large too. So the trend for that is also pretty reliable. And we see that the changes, I think in that sector, there's growth across all of the regions except for maybe 2 regions. Yeah, so this is a call for better data, for more data at such a granular level, which we don't have right now.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So a question from Ava in the chat. So you've highlighted the need for migration policies and employment policies to speak to each other. But how can we ensure that those who migrate here for work are welcomed and not challenged by racism or exclusion? So what influence can we make there? So Sarah, I don't know if I could come to you on this. I mean, I think there's also a related point around what Marta was discussing around kind of perceptions of the UK as an attractive place to come and work. And I know the PEC has done some work on that previously within the context of the EU exit, and also probably an aspect around kind of workplace practices in the sector. But I'm really interested to get your take on that question, and particularly around kind of maybe policies or industry intervention that might help kind of create that kind of good environment for people to come and work here in the UK
Yeah.
in the sector?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for this question, Eva. Well, I think that one important thing that I think our political system is not doing enough is to basically play a narrative that reinforces the benefits of migration. So there are economic, cultural, social benefits of migration and having more open borders. Unfortunately, we hear often the negative consequences of migration, but not the positive ones. And I think that is something that it's really a pity. Unfortunately, this is a global trend that we observe in Europe, in the US. What can we do to reverse this? Well, I think that we need to speak to our own politician that we elect and basically demand a redressing of this, because ultimately we are all migrants. I think when I think about what's happening in the US, and it's what is the proportion of migrants in the US, or you're just 1 generation, 2 generation away from immigrants, relatives. So it's actually the word, given the geopolitical dynamics here of the wars and so on, and the climate change, which is also going to be driving migration in the future. Let's not forget about that. Migration is here to stay, and so we need to make it work. Of course, there is more to do with integration, and there are cultural differences for sure, but we can see, we have examples of successful integration in the UK. So let's actually reinforce this example and make it make it work elsewhere. So that is my answer.
Marta, would you like to come in on this one?
Yes, because this is something I feel very passionately about, because of course what Sarah just said is true, and is also terribly difficult, right? And the political landscape is one. I mean, it was only a couple of weeks ago where we heard that this is an island of strangers, and so it couldn't be more. So in a way, the narrative is running away in terms of really getting the record straight on the benefits of migration for whatever reasons. Although look at what's happening in LA, also fights back sometimes. There is still this predominant feeling that politically is the whether it is because you need to contrast reform or whatever, that there is still, and the first port of call is still to really demonize and continuously sort of maintain a certain toxic approach to the debate on migration. And the idea of highlighting the benefits of migration remains, is contested and difficult. The other thing that is really important when it comes to the specific questions about integration, when it comes to what can be done to make sure that people are actually welcome and integrated and not, made to feel discriminated against. Of course, traditionally the policies around integrations are policies of investment. It's things like education and health and language and all the kind of things that then very quickly fight back politically, because it's all the things, and housing, dare I say, like the ultimate area, the ultimate combat line where who comes first, them or us, like the native or the foreigners. But this is one of the reasons why I have taken such an interest in the creative industries and creative economy and culture, because it offers almost like a different narrative in all of this. I think this idea that when it comes to sports or food or music or the arts, the contribution and the value that people have is something that is actually understood. And so the questions are, how do we make people feel welcome and integrated alongside the investment required? And I would say housing is probably the number one area where there is a real need to create that very concrete sense of welcoming. But alongside that, we are talking about sectors where fundamentally people in the UK can see, they have experienced the value and the contribution of creative minds and creative talents. Take Afrobeats just as one example, right, of something that has become popular and people understand, and or think about some of the football and sports and some of the stars. Anyway, it's just a thought to say that I think this is why it's so important to really consider the creative industries as a cornerstone of making this country an attractive one, and to almost make migration secondary to it, dare I say, like, to not make it a migration priority, but make it a priority for, you know, really maximizing the potential of the creative economy in this country. And then the fact that we need to attract talent from elsewhere, it might come a little bit more naturally than it does in other sectors, and perhaps a little bit more competitive, less competitively, again, because these are not areas where they're fighting over a smaller cake, right? Like whether it's health or education, this is something where people that bring new ideas are genuinely, you know, or generally understood to be making a valuable contribution.
Well, Marta, I feel like that was both perfectly timed and a point perfectly made. So we're now at 1 o'clock. So I think that was a brilliant way to bring this to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our launch today and for your questions, which I think have really demonstrated the kind of breadth of interest and engagement in this important issue. Huge thanks to our speakers and our respondents, Sarah, Daniel, Madeline, and Marta and Hassan. And thank you again to our funders, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, for making this work possible. So as we mentioned at the start of the event, we'll be sending the reports to everyone that signed up for the session. You'll also get a evaluation questionnaire to your inbox as well. So if you've got a moment, please do let us know what you'd like to see more of in these events in future. And lastly, please do keep an eye out through our newsletter for our upcoming State of the Nations reports in the next months as well. So thank you so much again for joining all of us today for the launch of this report, and we hope to see you all next time.